5 crumpled $1 bills. That was all it took to bring Chicago's most feared crime syndicate to a dead halt. Standing in the freezing rain outside Gibson's bar and steakhouse, a 7-year-old girl tugged on the tailored coat of a ruthless mob boss and handed him her life savings. She didn't ask for a toy or a warm meal. She asked him to save her mother. But it wasn't the money that stopped his cold heart. It was the exact 6 words she whispered next that turned his blood to ice. Rain lashed against the neon-lit pavement of Rush Street, washing away the grime of the city, but doing nothing to cleanse the sins of the men stepping out of Gibson's bar and steakhouse. Arthur Costello adjusted the collar of his bespoke Brioni suit, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. As the undisputed head of the Costello Syndicate, Arthur controlled the underground arteries of Chicago, from the docks of Lake Michigan to the high-rise boardrooms of the Gold Coast. He was a man built of sharp edges and cold calculation, surrounded by a phalanx of heavily armed bodyguards whose eyes scanned the shadows for any sign of a threat. Thomas Callahan. Arthur's massive right-hand man opened the door of a black armored Cadillac Escalade. "We secured the zoning permits for the South Side project, boss." Thomas murmured, his voice a low rumble over the torrential downpour. "The alderman took the envelope. No problems." Arthur barely nodded. His mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, calculating the next move in his endless game of power. He stepped toward the waiting SUV, his polished Oxford shoes splashing through a shallow puddle. Suddenly, a tiny figure darted past the heavy frame of the restaurant's valet. "Hey, grab her!" Thomas barked, his hand instinctively flying to the concealed holster beneath his jacket. 2 of Arthur's men lunged, but they were too slow, hindered by their own bulk and the sheer unpredictability of the tiny intruder. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7. She was soaked to the bone, her thin, oversized yellow raincoat clinging to her frail frame. Her blonde hair was plastered against her cheeks, and she was shivering violently. She didn't flinch at the sight of the towering, dangerous men surrounding her. Instead, she marched straight up to Arthur, throwing out her tiny hand to grab a handful of his expensive wool coat. "Whoa, kid, back off," Thomas warned, stepping in to pull her away. Arthur raised a single gloved hand. The gesture was silent, but it commanded absolute obedience. Thomas froze, stepping back into the rain. Arthur looked down at the child. In his world, people approached him with terror, with greed, or with a gun. Nobody approached him with a tug on his coat. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, his voice low and devoid of warmth. The little girl didn't back down. She reached into the deep pocket of her yellow raincoat and pulled out a small, incredibly soggy wad of paper. Her tiny, trembling fingers meticulously unfolded it, revealing 5 crumpled $1 bills. She held them up to Arthur, the rain quickly soaking the green ink. "I need to hire you," she said, her voice shaking from the cold, but possessing an eerie, unwavering certainty. "My name is Chloe. You have to save my mum. The bad men took her." Arthur stared at the pathetic offering in her hand. A humorless, cynical smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. $5, little girl, you're standing in front of the wrong man. I don't rescue cats from trees, and I don't work for pocket change. Where is your father?" "I don't have one," Chloe replied, her blue eyes wide and piercing. She thrust the money closer to his chest. "I know who you are. I followed your big cars. You're the boss. Please, take the money." "Get her to a police station, Thomas," Arthur commanded, turning away to step into the warmth of the Escalade. He was a monster, not a babysitter. He had an empire to run. "She said you would say no," Chloe yelled over the sound of the idling engine, her voice breaking. "She told me what to say if you said no." Arthur paused, 1 foot inside the vehicle. He didn't turn around. "And what is that?" Chloe took a deep breath, the rain streaming down her face. "My mum is Clara Hayes. She said to tell you, she's cashing in the promise you made at Navy Pier." Time stopped. The rain seemed to hang suspended in the air. The low hum of the Escalade faded into absolute silence. Arthur's entire body went rigid, every muscle locking down as if he had been struck by a high-voltage current. Slowly, very slowly, he turned around. The cynical smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. His dark eyes, usually dead and unreadable, widened as they bored into the little girl's face. "Clara Hayes, Navy Pier." He looked at Chloe's face again. He saw the shape of her jaw, the shade of her bright blue eyes. He felt the air leave his lungs in a sharp, painful rush. Without a word, Arthur stepped back out into the pouring rain. He dropped to one knee, uncaring that the filthy water was seeping into his $1,000 trousers. He gently took the 5 crumpled dollar bills from her freezing hand and slipped them into his breast pocket, right next to his heart. "Contract accepted," Arthur whispered. He stripped off his heavy, dry wool coat and wrapped it tightly around Chloe's shivering shoulders. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly into his arms, and turned to his men. "Thomas." Arthur's voice was no longer a low rumble. It was a razor-sharp blade. "Get in the car. We are going to war." The interior of the Cadillac Escalade was a sanctuary of heated leather and bulletproof glass, cutting off the violent storm raging outside. Arthur sat in the spacious back seat, the little girl huddled beside him, wrapped in his massive coat. She was clutching a bottle of water Thomas had handed her, her shivering slowly subsiding as the vehicle's high-end climate control did its work. Arthur sat in total silence, staring out the darkened window at the blurred lights of Michigan Avenue flashing by. His hand rested over his breast pocket, where the damp $5 lay hidden. His mind was a chaotic vortex of memories he had spent 10 years trying to drown in scotch and blood. 10 years ago, Arthur wasn't a boss. He was a low-level enforcer, a street rat taking beatings for men who didn't know his name. He had crossed a rival crew and paid the price, taking a bullet to the ribs. Bleeding out and running for his life, he had stumbled into the shadows beneath the massive Ferris wheel at Navy Pier, fully expecting to die in the dirt. That was where Clara found him. She was a nursing student working a summer job at a concession stand. Instead of screaming, instead of running away or calling the cops, she had dragged him into an abandoned storage shed. She had used her rudimentary medical kit and torn strips of her own uniform to stop the bleeding staying with him through the feverish night. They fell in love in the shadows. For 6 months, Clara was his entire world. She was the only clean, beautiful thing in a life built entirely on violence. But the violence always catches up. When a hit was put out on Arthur, he realized that staying with Clara was a death sentence for her. He did the only thing he could to protect her. He vanished into the night without a word, leaving her behind to keep her safe. He had made a promise to her under that Ferris wheel that if she ever needed his life, it was hers. He never thought she would claim it. He certainly never thought she had a child. His child. The timeline in his head was a desperate blur of math. Chloe was 7. It was possible. It was agonizingly possible. "Thomas." Arthur snapped, breaking the heavy silence in the car. "What do we have?" In the front passenger seat, Thomas was rapidly typing on an encrypted iPad, his thick fingers moving with surprising agility. "I'm in the grid, boss. Running Clara Hayes. Found an address in Pilsen. Looks like she's a pediatric nurse at Rush University Medical Center. Clean record. But..." Thomas hesitated, glancing back through the rearview mirror. "But what?" Arthur's tone was deadly. "Financials are a mess," Thomas reported grimly. "Massive medical debt. It looks like the kid Chloe had some serious pulmonary issues a few years back. Surgery's specialists. The insurance didn't cover it. Clara maxed out everything. When the banks shut her off, she went to the street. Who holds her paper? Arthur demanded, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the leather armrest. Declan Gallagher. Thomas replied, spitting the name out like poison. Arthur's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Declan Gallagher was a brutal, volatile Irish enforcer who had splintered off from the South Side crews to run a vicious loan, sharking and extortion ring. He operated out of the dilapidated industrial yards near the South Branch of the Chicago River. Gallagher wasn't a businessman. He was a butcher who enjoyed breaking bones when payments were late. "How long ago did they take her?" Arthur asked, looking down at Chloe. The little girl wiped her nose with the sleeve of his giant coat. "I was hiding in the closet. The men kicked the door down. They yelled at her about money. It was right after I got home from school, 3 hours ago." 3 hours. With a monster like Gallagher, 3 hours was an eternity. "Tell the driver to head to the Ashland Avenue chop shop," Arthur commanded. "Call the strike team. I want every available man armed and converging on Gallagher's perimeter in 20 minutes. Tell them to bring the heavy gear. Nobody leaves that yard alive unless I say so. Boss, you want to breach Gallagher's fortress without council approval?" Thomas asked carefully. "It's going to start a turf war. I don't care if it burns the entire city to ashes." Arthur snarled, his mask of composure completely shattering. He reached out and gently smoothed a damp lock of blonde hair away from Chloe's forehead. His hand, which had ordered the deaths of dozens of men without a tremor, was shaking. "They took what is mine. Today Declan Gallagher ceases to exist." The abandoned meatpacking plant on the edge of the South Branch River loomed in the darkness like a decaying concrete monolith. The rain was coming down in sheets, hiding the approach of 4 black, matte-finished tactical vans. They rolled to a silent halt a block away from the rusted chain-link perimeter. Arthur stepped out into the storm, trading his bespoke suit jacket for a heavy Kevlar vest. He racked the slide of his customized Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine gun, the metallic clack sounding unnervingly loud in the dead of the night. He had left Chloe safely locked in the Escalade, guarded by 4 of his most lethal men, with strict orders to drive her to a safe house if anything went wrong. Around Arthur, 12 highly trained enforcers materialized from the vans, clad in black tactical gear and night vision goggles. These weren't street thugs. They were Arthur's personal hit squad, former military operators, who answered only to the Costello syndicate. Thomas stood beside him, clutching a heavy-gauge combat shotgun. "Perimeter guards are neutralized," a voice crackled through Arthur's earpiece. "Snipers have eyes on the second-floor office. 2 hostiles plus Gallagher. They have a female hostage tied to a chair." "We go loud on my mark," Arthur whispered into his mic. "Shoot to kill, but if anyone touches a hair on Clara's head, I'll skin you alive myself." They moved like phantoms through the mud and debris, stacking up against the rusted steel door of the loading dock. Arthur placed a breaching charge against the lock. He held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. The explosion shattered the night, tearing the steel door off its hinges in a blinding flash of fire and smoke. Arthur poured into the building, his weapon raised. The cavernous warehouse was filled with stolen cars and chop shop machinery. Gallagher's thugs were caught completely off guard. The Costello syndicate moved with lethal precision. Suppressed gunfire spit through the dim light, dropping 3 armed men before they could even draw their weapons. Arthur didn't bother with the foot soldiers. His eyes were locked on the illuminated glass windows of the foreman's office, overlooking the warehouse floor. He sprinted up the metal-grated stairs, Thomas right behind him, covering his flank. A man stepped out of the office doorway, raising a pistol. Arthur fired a 3-round burst without breaking stride. center mass dropping the man over the railing to the concrete floor below. Arthur kicked the wooden office door so hard the frame splintered into kindling. He stepped into the room, his weapon trained dead ahead. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cigars, sweat, and copper. There she was. Clara Hayes was tied to a metal chair in the center of the room. Her beautiful face was bruised, her lip split and bleeding. Her clothes were torn and she looked exhausted, but the defiance in her eyes was exactly as Arthur remembered it. Standing behind her, one arm wrapped around her neck, and the barrel of a silver revolver pressed hard against her temple, was Declan Gallagher. "Back the hell off, Costello!" Gallagher screamed, his eyes wide, with a mixture of rage and terror, as he realized whose men had just slaughtered his crew. "I don't know why you're crashing my yard, but you take one more step and I paint this glass with her brains." Clara's eyes flickered from the gun barrel to the man standing in the doorway. Through the blood and the years, she recognized him instantly. "Artie," she whispered, her voice cracking. Hearing her say his name after 10 years was a physical blow to his chest. Arthur lowered his MP5 slightly, keeping his eyes locked entirely on Gallagher. His expression was a terrifying portrait of absolute calm. "Declan," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "You have 5 seconds to take that gun away from her head. If you do, I promise you, a quick death." "She owes me 60 grand, Gallagher spat, pulling Clara tighter against him. "She's mine until the debt is paid. You don't break the street rules. Costello, your debt has been bought out," Arthur said coldly. "I paid $5 for her contract, and the Costello Syndicate always honors its contracts." Gallagher let out a manic, desperate laugh. "You're crazy. I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll—" Arthur didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. In a fraction of a second, Arthur's right hand whipped to his waist, drawing a silenced 9mm pistol he kept concealed for close-quarters work. He didn't aim. He simply fired from muscle memory. The silenced shot was a quiet thwip over the pounding rain outside. The bullet struck Gallagher squarely in the bridge of his nose. The Irish mobster's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed instantly, his heavy body crashing to the linoleum floor. The silver revolver clattered harmlessly away. Arthur dropped his weapons and fell to his knees in front of Clara. His hands were trembling violently as he fumbled with the thick ropes binding her wrists. "I've got you," he choked out, his cold Mafia persona entirely vanishing. "Clara, I'm so sorry. I've got you." Clara slumped forward into his chest as the ropes fell away. She buried her face in his tactical vest, sobbing uncontrollably. Arthur wrapped his arms tightly around her, burying his face in her hair. It smelled like rain and blood, but to him, it was the only thing that had ever felt like home. "Chloe," Clara gasped, clutching his vest. "Artie, my baby girl. Where is she? They tried to find her." "She's safe," Arthur whispered fiercely, holding her face in his hands. "She's in my car. She's the one who sent me." Clara looked up at him, her tear-streaked eyes searching his face. A weak, exhausted smile crossed her lips before her eyes rolled back, and she lost consciousness, her body going limp in his arms. "Thomas," Arthur roared, lifting Clara effortlessly into his arms and turning to the doorway. "Get the medics ready at Northwestern. Tell them if she doesn't get the best care in the city, I'm burning the hospital to the ground." Arthur carried her down the metal stairs, stepping over the bodies of the men who had dared to touch her. The storm outside was raging, but inside Arthur Costello, a dead man had just come back to life, and the real war was only just beginning. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile, heavily guarded VIP wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The entire 12th floor had been locked down. Armed men in tailored suits stood near the elevators and stairwells, their eyes scanning the empty corridors with lethal intent. In the center of it, all pacing like a caged predator, was Arthur Costello. He had stripped off his blood-soaked Kevlar vest, leaving him in a rumpled, sweat-stained white dress shirt. His knuckles were bruised, and a faint smear of Declan Gallagher's blood still stained his left cuff. But Arthur didn't care about his appearance. His mind was entirely focused on the closed door of room 1204. "Boss," Thomas said, quietly, stepping out of the shadows with 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He handed one to Arthur. "The perimeter is secure. Police have been completely entirely shut out of the chop shop investigation. Our cleanup crew scrubbed the site. Officially, Declan Gallagher and his men vanished in a territory dispute." Arthur took the coffee but didn't drink it. "And Chloe?" "Sleeping peacefully in the adjoining suite," Thomas replied, his gruff voice softening just a fraction. "Got one of the female operatives sitting with her. The kid was exhausted. She out cold before her head hit the pillow." Arthur nodded, staring into the dark liquid in his cup. "Did you run the DNA test?" Thomas hesitated, glancing around the empty hallway before stepping closer. He pulled a folded sealed envelope from his inner jacket pocket. "I pulled a favor with Dr. Alcott in the genetics lab. Expedited processing. He just handed this to me." Arthur's heart slammed against his ribs. He set the coffee cup down on a nearby rolling tray with a trembling hand. For a man who regularly ordered executions and manipulated millions of dollars without batting an eye opening, this simple white envelope felt like standing in front of a firing squad. He broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the medical jargon, dropping straight to the conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity 99.9%. The breath left Arthur's lungs in a violent rush. He squeezed his eyes shut, leaning heavily against the pristine white wall. Chloe was his. That brave, terrified little girl standing in the freezing rain with her life savings. She was his daughter. The realization was a tidal wave of profound love and crushing guilt. He had missed 7 years. 7 years of birthdays, first steps, and nightmares. He had left Clara alone to face a terrifying medical system and the brutal realities of the Chicago underworld, all because he thought he was protecting her. The door to room 1204 clicked open, breaking Arthur out of his spiral. Dr. Benjamin Alcott, a premier trauma surgeon on Arthur's private payroll, stepped out, pulling off his surgical mask. "She's awake, Arthur," Dr. Alcott said in a hushed tone. 3 broken ribs, a fractured orbital bone, and severe exhaustion. "We've pumped her full of fluids and broad-spectrum antibiotics. She's incredibly lucky. A few more hours in that warehouse, and her internal injuries would have gone septic." "Can I see her?" Arthur demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, but keep it brief. She needs rest." Arthur pushed past the doctor, stepping into the dimly lit hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound. Clara lay in the center of the bed, looking impossibly small amidst the tangle of IV tubes and pristine white sheets. The right side of her beautiful face was heavily bruised, a bandage covering the laceration near her temple. When she heard the door close, her eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain medication, but the moment they locked onto Arthur, a spark of fierce clarity returned. "Artie," she breathed, trying to sit up. "Don't move. Please, Clara, don't move," Arthur pleaded, rushing to her bedside. He pulled up a chair and gently took her uninjured hand in both of his, bringing her knuckles to his lips. "You're safe. You're at Northwestern. Gallagher is dead. Nobody will ever hurt you again." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, spilling over her bruised cheeks. "Chloe, Is she really okay? She's asleep in the next room, Arthur promised, his voice cracking. She's perfectly safe. He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. She's the one who found me, Clara. She handed me $5 and told me she was cashing in your promise. Clara let out a wet, choked laugh. She emptied her piggy bank. I told her the story about Navy Pier 100 times. It was our bedtime story. I just changed the ending. I told her the Dark Knight went away to fight dragons. When Gallagher kicked the door in, I shoved her in the closet and gave her your name. I told her if I didn't come back, to find the man in the big black cars. Arthur reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the 5 crumpled, damp dollar bills. He laid them gently on the hospital tray table. It's the most expensive contract I've ever taken. Silence stretched between them, heavy with a decade of unspoken words. Finally, Arthur reached into his pocket again and pulled out the folded DNA results. He placed it next to the money. Clara looked at the paper, then back up at Arthur. She didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. You know. Why didn't you tell me, Clara? Arthur whispered, the agonizing ache in his chest threatening to tear him apart. 10 years ago, I walked away because I thought being near me was a death sentence for you. If I had known you were pregnant, I would have burned my own empire to the ground to keep you safe. Why didn't you come to me when her medical bills piled up? Why go to a monster like Gallagher? Clara's grip on his hand tightened. Because I knew what you had become, Artie, she said softly, her voice filled with a heartbreaking honesty. I watched the news. I saw Arthur Costello rise to the top of the Chicago syndicate. You were surrounded by blood bullets and enemies. Chloe was born with a severe ventricular septal defect, a hole in her tiny heart. She was so fragile. I couldn't bring her into a world where she might catch a bullet meant for you. Arthur lowered his head, a single silent tear slipping down his hardened face. She was right. She had always been right. The surgeries cost hundreds of thousands. Clara continued, her voice trembling. Insurance dropped us. The banks laughed at me. I was desperate. A nurse at the hospital mentioned a guy in Pilsen who gave loans with no questions asked. I didn't know Gallagher was mob-connected until it was too late. I missed 2 payments, and the interest compounded. Suddenly I owed him $60,000. He told me if I didn't pay, he would take Chloe and sell her to cover the debt. A blinding, murderous rage flared behind Arthur's eyes. Killing Gallagher hadn't been enough. He wished he could bring the Irish butcher back to life, just to torture him for a month. I'm sorry, Artie, Clara sobbed. I was just trying to protect our little girl. Never apologize to me, Arthur said, fiercely, leaning in to press his forehead against hers. You kept her alive. You are the strongest person I have ever known. But you don't have to fight anymore, Clara. I am taking you both home. My home. You will never want for anything, and I swear on my life the violence of my world will never touch either of you. It was a beautiful promise. But in the Chicago underworld, promises were written in blood, and debts rarely died with the men who held them. 48 hours later, a convoy of heavily armored black SUVs passed through the towering wrought-iron gates of the Costello estate in Lake Forest. The sprawling 50-acre compound was a fortress disguised as a luxury mansion. High stone walls equipped with motion sensors and razor wire surrounded the perimeter. Roving patrols of armed men walked the grounds alongside massive cane corsos. Clara sat in the back of Arthur's Escalade, her hand resting protectively over Chloe, who was staring out the window with wide, awe-struck eyes. Clara's bruising was beginning to fade to a dull yellow, but the stark reality of Arthur's life was hitting her harder than Gallagher's fists ever could. She was a pediatric nurse who lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment. She was currently entering a citadel built entirely on crime extortion and power. As the car rolled to a stop in front of the massive stone portico, Arthur turned back to them. He was back in his tailored armor, a midnight blue three-piece suit, looking every inch the terrifying king of Chicago. But when he looked at Clara and Chloe, his eyes softened completely. "Welcome home," Arthur said gently. He stepped out and opened the door for them. Chloe practically bounded out of the car, her earlier trauma temporarily erased by the sheer scale of the mansion. "Mommy, look. It looks like a castle." "It is a castle, Principessa," Arthur said, smiling as he ruffled her blonde hair. "And you can play anywhere you want. Thomas is going to introduce you to the chefs in the kitchen. I hear they have a machine that makes infinite ice cream." Chloe gasped, grabbing Thomas's massive calloused hand. The giant enforcer looked utterly terrified of breaking the tiny girl, but he allowed himself to be dragged toward the grand oak doors. "Come on, Mr. Tommy." Clara stood by the car, wrapping her sweater tighter against the brisk lake wind. She looked at the armed guards stationed at the entrance. "It's overwhelming, Artie. It feels like a military base." "It's the safest place in the Western Hemisphere," Arthur assured her, wrapping an arm around her waist and guiding her inside. "I have doctors setting up a private clinic in the East Wing for your recovery and a tutor arriving tomorrow for Chloe. You have nothing to worry about." But Arthur was lying. 3 hours later, while Clara was resting in the master suite and Chloe was eating her weight in strawberry gelato, Arthur stood in the cavernous mahogany-paneled library. The heavy double doors were locked. Spread across the massive oak desk were satellite photos, encrypted financial ledgers, and gruesome crime scene photos. Thomas stood on the opposite side of the desk, his face grim. "We have a massive problem, boss, and it's not the Irish." Arthur poured himself 2 fingers of Louis XIII cognac. "Talk to me." Declan Gallagher was a street-level butcher, but he didn't have the capital to fund a $60,000 loan, let alone the millions he was pushing on the streets. He was a front. Thomas slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a heavily tattooed, cold-eyed man with a shaved head walking out of a high-end Moscow nightclub. Arthur's blood ran cold. "Alexei Volkov, the Bratva," Thomas confirmed. "The Volkov syndicate used Gallagher to launder their dirty money through Chicago's South Side. When you put a bullet in Gallagher's head and seized his chop shop, you didn't just kill an Irish thug. You disrupted a $50 million laundering pipeline for the Russian mob." Arthur took a slow sip of the cognac. The Volkovs were ruthless, even by Mafia standards. They didn't care about rules, council sit-downs, or collateral damage. If someone crossed them, they eradicated the target's entire bloodline to send a message. 3 hours ago, Alexei Volkov touched down at O'Hare on a private jet. Thomas continued his voice, dropping an octave. "He just sent an envoy to the neutral zone at the Continental Hotel. He wants a meeting tonight." "He wants my head on a platter," Arthur corrected smoothly. "Boss, the council is panicking. They know you hit Gallagher without a sanctioned vote. Now the Russians are breathing down our necks. Alexei sent a message through the envoy." Thomas swallowed hard. "He knows why you hit Gallagher. He knows about the woman. And he knows about the kid." The crystal glass in Arthur's hand shattered. 80-year-old cognac and shards of glass rained down onto the mahogany desk, but Arthur didn't flinch. A terrifying, predatory silence fell over the room. Thomas took a subtle step back. He had known Arthur Costello for 15 years, but he had never seen the look that currently twisted the boss's face. It wasn't anger. It was a promise of apocalyptic violence. "Alexei Volkov threatened my daughter," Arthur whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal frequency. He said the debt remains unpaid. Thomas replied carefully. And the Bratva collects its debts in blood. He wants you to surrender Clara and Chloe, plus 10 million in reparations, or he's going to wage a war that will turn Chicago into a graveyard. Arthur slowly reached for a microfiber cloth and wiped the blood and alcohol from his unfeeling hand. He walked over to a hidden panel behind a massive oil painting, pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner, and pulled open a hidden vault. The interior was lined with military-grade weaponry. "Thomas," Arthur said, pulling out a custom long slide, M1911 pistol, and checking the magazine. "Call the captains. Empty the armories. I want every man in the Costello syndicate locked, loaded, and on the streets within the hour. Tell them the rules of engagement are officially suspended. Boss a war with the Volkovs. The streets will run red. The feds will bring the National Guard down on us." Arthur turned to face his oldest friend. "I told Clara that the violence of my world would never touch her or my daughter. If I have to slaughter every Russian mobster from here to Siberia to keep that promise, I will do it without losing a second of sleep." He racked the slide of the pistol, slipping it into his shoulder holster. "Tell the envoy I accept the meeting at the Continental, but I'm not going to negotiate." "What are you going to do?" Thomas asked, a feral grin slowly spreading across his face. Arthur's eyes were dead and black. "I'm going to introduce Alexei Volkov to the monster that little girl paid $5 for." Midnight draped itself over the neon-soaked skyline of Chicago, casting long, weeping shadows across the rain-slicked pavement. The Continental Hotel stood as a monolith of old-world power in the heart of the Loop. For decades, this neo-Gothic fortress had served as the ultimate neutral ground for the global underworld. No blood was to be spilled on its marble floors. No weapons were to be drawn within its gold-leafed halls. Breaking the rules of the Continental meant excommunication and a death sentence enforced by every syndicate on the planet. Arthur Costello stepped out of his armored Mercedes-Benz Maybach, his midnight blue Brioni suit cutting a terrifying silhouette against the storm. He did not look like a man walking into a peace negotiation. He looked like the angel of death. Flanked by Thomas Callahan and 6 heavily armed enforcers, Arthur moved with a slow, predatory grace up the grand limestone steps. The heavy brass doors were pulled open by stoic concierges who averted their eyes. They knew who Arthur was. More importantly, they knew what kind of mood he was in. The air around him practically crackled with lethal intent. Inside the cavernous lobby, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The crystal chandeliers cast a cold, fractured light over the 24 Russian operatives occupying the space. These were Bratva hardliners men with Spetsnaz training and prison tattoos sprawling across their necks. They wore tailored black suits, but nothing could hide the savage brutality in their eyes. As Arthur's men entered, hands instinctively drifted toward concealed holsters. A violent kinetic energy hummed in the room, threatening to ignite into a bloodbath at the slightest provocation. "Arthur Costello," a voice echoed from the grand mahogany staircase. Alexei Volkov descended the steps with the arrogant swagger of a czar. He was a mountain of a man, his bald head gleaming under the lights, his jawline sharp and cruel. A thick, jagged scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from a Siberian gulag. Alexei wore a blood-red silk shirt beneath a charcoal Tom Ford suit, a diamond-encrusted Audemars Piguet watch flashing on his thick wrist. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, a condescending smirk twisting his lips as he surveyed Arthur. "I must admit," Alexei poured in heavily accented English, his voice a gravelly baritone, "I expected you to bring an army. Instead, you bring a handful of men. Perhaps the great king of Chicago is finally losing his edge, or perhaps you have simply come to surrender." Arthur stopped 10 feet away from the Russian boss. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. His dark eyes were devoid of any human emotion, cold and impenetrable as obsidian. "I brought exactly what I need, Alexei," Arthur replied, his voice dangerously quiet, echoing clearly across the silent lobby. "You requested a meeting to discuss a debt. So let us discuss it." Alexei chuckled a dry, humorless sound. He gestured to a private seating area cordoned off by heavy velvet ropes. 2 wingback leather chairs sat facing each other across a low mahogany table. "Sit. Let us behave like businessmen before the unpleasantness begins." Arthur moved to the chair and sat down, crossing his legs with infuriating calm. Thomas stood directly behind his right shoulder, his massive hand resting near the lapel of his jacket. Alexei took the opposite seat, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees, his massive hands clasped together. "Declan Gallagher was a pig." Alexei began, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "He was loud, undisciplined, and greedy. But he was my pig. He laundered $8 million a month for my organization through his South Side operations. When you put a bullet in his head, you didn't just kill a man, Arthur. You burned down my bank." "Gallagher touched something that belonged to me," Arthur stated flatly. "His death was a professional courtesy. He was a rabid dog. I put him down. And the woman, the nurse..." Alexei's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "My intelligence network is unparalleled, Arthur. I know exactly who Clara Hayes is. I know she gave you a daughter. A beautiful, fragile little girl. Gallagher's debt was $60,000. But since you have destroyed my infrastructure, the price has gone up. I want $10 million wired to my accounts in the Cayman Islands by sunrise. And I want the woman and the child delivered to my men as collateral until my Chicago operations are rebuilt." A deadly silence fell over the lobby. The Bratva soldiers shifted their weight, their eyes locked on Arthur's men. Thomas's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. To demand a boss's family as collateral was an insult that could only be answered with immediate catastrophic violence. Arthur slowly reached into his suit jacket. Instantly, a dozen Russian hands flew to their weapons. Thomas and the Costello enforcers mirrored the movement, the sound of safety catches clicking off, echoing like firecrackers in the quiet room. "Stand down," Arthur commanded softly, his eyes never leaving Alexei's face. He pulled his hand from his jacket. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small silver thumb drive. He tossed it onto the mahogany table. It clattered against the wood and slid to a halt inches from Alexei's hands. "What is this?" Alexei demanded, his smirk faltering slightly. "That is my counteroffer," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You see, Alexei, while you were flying across the Atlantic, dreaming of how you were going to extort me, I was making phone calls. You think you are the only one with an intelligence network. You operate out of Moscow, but your true wealth, your illicit arms, caches your shipping manifests. They are all hidden in a series of shell companies based in Cyprus." Alexei's face went rigid, the color draining from his cheeks. 10 minutes ago." Arthur continued, his eyes burning with a dark, demonic fire. "A team of digital mercenaries on my payroll infiltrated the central servers of the Bank of Nicosia. They bypassed your encrypted firewalls. Every single dollar you have hidden away, over 400 million, has been rerouted. It is gone, Alexei, scattered across 10,000 ghost accounts in the dark web." "You are lying," Alexei snarled, slamming his fist onto the table, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his panic. "Check the drive," Arthur said coldly. "It contains the transaction receipts, but that is only the beginning. The shipping crates you have sitting in the port of St. Petersburg, the ones loaded with illegal munitions bound for the Syrian cartels, I sent an anonymous tip to the Russian Federal Security Service. They are raiding the docks as we speak. By tomorrow morning, you will not only be bankrupt, but you will be hunted by your own government as a traitor." Alexei stared at Arthur, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The invincible Bratva boss had been dismantled in the span of 30 minutes without a single shot being fired. The reality of his total ruin crashed over him like a suffocating wave. You cannot do this." Alexei choked out his arrogance, entirely shattered. "The council, the rules. There are no rules when it comes to my family," Arthur hissed, leaning forward, his face inches from the Russians. The terrifying monster that Clara had feared, the apex predator of the Chicago underworld, was fully unleashed. "You threatened my daughter. You thought you could walk into my city and leverage the only things in this world I care about. You made a fatal miscalculation, Volkov." Arthur reached into his breast pocket one final time. He pulled out a single crisp $5 bill. He placed it delicately on the table, right next to the silver thumb drive. "This is the only payment you will ever receive from me," Arthur said. "It is the price of your life. Take it, walk out of this hotel board your private jet, and never return to the Western Hemisphere. If I ever see your face again, if I ever hear a whisper of the Bratva operating in my city, I will not just bankrupt you. I will dismantle you, piece by bloody piece." Alexei Volkov looked at the $5 bill, then up at Arthur's dead eyes. He knew he had lost. He had tried to play chess with a man who was willing to burn the entire board to the ground. Slowly, with shaking hands, Alexei picked up the thumb drive and the $5 bill. Without a word, he stood up, pushed past his bewildered soldiers, and walked out into the stormy Chicago night a broken and defeated man. "Let's go home, Thomas," Arthur said, adjusting his cuffs as he stood up. The war was over before it even began. Golden morning light filtered through the towering arched windows of the Costello estate, casting a warm glow over the sprawling master suite. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, clear Chicago dawn. Arthur stood in front of the vanity mirror, his shirt off, staring at his reflection. His torso was a map of old scars, bullet wounds, and knife slashes, a brutal testament to the life he had chosen. He slowly wrapped a fresh white bandage around a minor laceration on his forearm, a leftover injury from the breach of Gallagher's chop shop. His mind was heavy. He had neutralized the Bratva threat, but the sheer scale of the violence he had orchestrated weighed on him. He had promised Clara that his dark world would never touch her, but last night he had dragged her right into the center of it. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Clara stepped into the room. She was wearing one of Arthur's oversized silk dress shirts, the fabric falling to her mid-thigh. The bruising on her face was healing, but the trauma of the past few days still lingered in her exhausted eyes. She walked up behind him, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug, and gently rested her cheek against his bare back, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You're awake early," Arthur murmured, turning around to pull her into a gentle embrace. He kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her lavender shampoo. "Where is Chloe?" "She's downstairs in the kitchen." Clara replied, a soft, weary smile touching her lips. "Thomas is letting her help make pancakes. I think she's trying to cover him in flour. He looks terrified." Arthur let out a quiet chuckle, the sound foreign to his own ears. "Callahan has killed men with his bare hands, but a 7-year-old with a whisk is his kryptonite." Clara's smile faded slightly as she looked up at him. She reached out her delicate fingers, tracing the edge of the new bandage on his forearm. "I saw the news this morning, Artie. The reports about the Russian shipping ports being raided. The sudden collapse of a major Cyprus financial firm. The reporters are calling it a massive international crackdown. But I know it was you. I know what you did last night." Arthur's jaw tightened. He pulled away slightly, guilt twisting his stomach into knots. He walked over to the window, staring out at the expansive manicured lawns and the high security walls that separated them from the rest of the world. "I did what I had to do, Clara," Arthur said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Alexei Volkov demanded you and Chloe as payment for Gallagher's debt. I eradicated his empire to make sure he could never threaten you again. But I broke my promise. I told you this violence wouldn't touch you. And yet here you are, locked in a fortress, hiding behind armed guards and bulletproof glass. I wanted to give you a fairy tale. Instead, I gave you a gilded cage." He expected her to cry. He expected her to demand to leave to pack Chloe's bags and run far away from the blood and the shadows. Instead, Clara walked over to him, her expression hardening into something fierce and uncompromising. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to look her in the eyes. "Listen to me, Arthur Costello," Clara said, her voice completely devoid of fear. 10 years ago, you made a choice for me. You left me in the dark because you thought I was too fragile to handle your world. You thought you were protecting me. But your protection left me vulnerable to monsters like Declan Gallagher. It left me begging for my daughter's life while men put guns to my head. Arthur swallowed hard, the truth of her words cutting deeper than any blade. "I am not a fragile little girl who needs to be shielded from the truth," Clara continued, her blue eyes blazing with a terrifying, beautiful fire. "I am the mother of your child. I survived the streets of this city, I survived the debt collectors, and I survived the butchers. You didn't lock me in a cage, Artie. You gave me a castle. But if I am going to live in this castle, I am not going to be a damsel hiding in the tower. I am going to be the queen." Arthur stared at her, completely stunned. The woman standing before him wasn't the terrified nursing student he had fallen in love with at Navy Pier. She was a survivor, forged in the fires of adversity, and she possessed a strength that rivaled his own. "What are you saying, Clara?" Arthur whispered. "I am saying that I am not running away this time," Clara stated firmly, her grip on his chin tightening. "I am staying. Chloe is staying. This is our family now. But if we are going to survive in your world, I need to know how it works. No more secrets. No more shadows. I want to know who your enemies are. I want to know how the syndicates operate. Teach me, Artie. Teach me how to protect our empire, because I will burn this city down myself before I let anyone hurt our daughter again." A profound sense of awe washed over Arthur. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just found his lost love. He had found his true equal, a partner who wouldn't just stand behind him, but would rule beside him. He pulled Clara fiercely against his chest, kissing her with a desperate, consuming passion that had been buried for 10 agonizing years. "Okay." Arthur breathed against her lips, his heart pounding with a renewed sense of purpose. "No more secrets. We rule this city together." Downstairs, the heavy oak doors of the grand dining room swung open. Arthur and Clara walked in, hand in hand. The long mahogany table was set for a feast. At the far end, Chloe was sitting on a booster seat, her face covered in powdered sugar and maple syrup. Thomas Callahan, the most feared enforcer in Chicago, was sitting next to her, awkwardly wearing a tiny pink paper crown on his bald head while he cut her pancakes into small squares. Chloe looked up as her parents entered the room, her eyes lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. "Mummy, Daddy, look, Mr. Tommy made me a crown. He says I'm a princess." Arthur felt a sudden, overwhelming tightness in his chest. Daddy. It was the first time she had called him that. The single word cracked the last remaining ice around his hardened heart. He walked over to his daughter, leaning down to kiss her syrup-sticky cheek. "You are a princess, Chloe." Arthur smiled, his eyes suspiciously bright. "The most important one in the world." Clara sat down beside them, a genuine radiant smile illuminating her face. For the first time in years, she felt completely, undeniably safe. The nightmare was over. Later that afternoon, after the plates were cleared, and Chloe was busy exploring the gardens with her new security detail, Arthur called Clara into his private study. The dark mahogany room was exactly as he had left it the night before, save for one new addition. On the center of his massive desk, resting prominently next to his ledger books and a loaded silver 1911 pistol, was a newly purchased custom-made frame. It was crafted from solid ebony wood and lined with crushed red velvet. Clara walked over to the desk, her breath catching in her throat. Secured perfectly in the center of the frame were 5 crumpled, water-stained $1 bills. "I wanted to put it somewhere where I would see it every single day," Arthur said softly, stepping up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking at the framed money. "A reminder of the exact moment my life actually began." Clara leaned back against him, reaching out to trace the glass over the crumpled bills. It was a paltry sum of money, a child's pocket change, but in the violent, treacherous world of Arthur Costello, those $5 had bought something that millions in illicit gold could never afford. It had bought him redemption. It had bought him a soul. "Best investment she ever made," Clara whispered, resting her hand over his. Arthur smiled, his grip on her tightening. "The contract is fulfilled, my love. The bad men are gone, and they are never, ever coming back." Outside, the Chicago sun blazed high over the Costello estate, illuminating a fortress that was no longer just a stronghold for criminals, but a sanctuary for a family, reborn from the ashes of the underworld. The king had found his queen, the princess was safe, and the $5 contract had officially changed the course of history forever. If you felt the intense drama and emotional twists of Arthur and Clara's story, hit that like button right now to show your support. This is only the beginning of their journey. Don't miss out on what happens next. Share this incredible story of loyalty, sacrifice, and redemption with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for the upcoming parts where secrets are revealed and the Mafia war explodes. Drop a comment below on what you think Arthur will do next.